Happy Friday, everybody. Sam Shapiro back here with more of your Heat latest on FanArc. Well, if you haven't checked out Underdog Fantasy yet, congratulations. You are indeed living under a rock. With the MLB now back in full swing, the NBA winding down, and us in the middle of college ball action, there are a number of picks you can go and make over on the app, and you can actually take a look at some of those picks by downloading the app today and getting started right here with this QR code right here on your screen. And when you use promo code BasketballFan, you can score $75 in bonus entries when you play your first $5. So thank you to Underdog for sponsoring today's video. And Miami making a push through their final 9 games of the regular season in hopefully what will lead them out of the play-in tournament. But I think at this point, they've pretty much solidified their legacy. Looking at the standings right now. Now, granted, I'm taking a look here at what the playoff bracket will look like before the matchups with Orlando and Charlotte took place last night. But just looking at this playoff bracket here, it's got Miami seeded 8th overall in the playoffs with Charlotte and Orlando at 9 and 10 respectively, with those teams pretty much in a little bit of a three-way tie, at least from when I saw it last. Miami only being ahead by 1 win. Those other 2 teams sitting at 38 and 34 at the time I'm looking versus Miami 39 and 34. So those seeds I feel like are extremely interchangeable through these next couple of games. And we could see a lot of those teams bouncing around in addition to Philly and maybe even Toronto, which are, I believe, only a game or 2 ahead. So between the Hornets, the Magic, Philly, and Miami, and maybe even Toronto, those 5 teams could be flip-flopping around where they are in the mix of the playoff action in the coming days even. So at least how the playoff bracket in the Eastern Conference looks right now with Miami sitting at 39 and 34, they've got the Heat playing Philly as the 7th seed in the first round of the play-in tournament. The winner of or the loser of that matchup between Miami and Philly will go up against the winner of Charlotte versus Orlando. And then the winner of that matchup will go and play Detroit as the 8th seed. Now, this I personally think could work to Miami's benefit if in terms of they're trying to avoid Orlando in the play-in tournament, because I definitely think they could beat Charlotte if they have to go toe-to-toe with them. I think they have a chance against Philly. I don't want to say it's completely written that they would lose to Orlando, but considering you haven't been able to beat them all regular season long, they are the last team I want Miami to go up against in the play-in tournament this season. So, in this scenario, hopefully Miami can find a way to beat Philly and then face up against Boston as the 7th seed going into the playoffs. And it's funny saying out loud, I hope Miami has to play Boston, but I'd very much rather have them play Boston, who is, I feel like, still kind of getting used to having Jason Tatum back on their team, despite obviously being the Celtics and knowing how to win basketball games. I would not want to go up against the Detroit Pistons right now, assuming that Cade Cunningham might be available in time for the playoffs to tip off. Obviously, sidelined right now, but I mean, I don't personally. Miami has a heated rivalry with Boston going way back a number of seasons now, and I just think that Miami would be ready to pour on the heat against this Boston Celtics team. Now, that's not me saying Miami's going to come out and win a 7-game series against Boston, but I definitely think they could make it a little bit more competitive than the sweep we had seen the season before against Cleveland in the first round. So, and that's not to say Miami would get swept by Detroit either, but I could definitely see more of a 4-1 exit against Detroit with a healthy Cade Cunningham in comparison to potentially having to go, or in comparison to maybe bringing a series with Boston to 6 or 7 games, because this Miami team has experience going toe-to-toe. Obviously, the roster looks a little bit different than what it did when Jimmy Butler was leading the way for Miami, which I would maybe say in the devil's advocate defense, why some might argue going up against Detroit might be a better bet for Miami, because they're a less experienced team in a postseason situation like this. So Miami is definitely in the heat of it all with the, I guess, standings kind of changing who could be where when the play-in tournament starts. But I think it's pretty safe to say these 4 teams, Philly, Miami, Orlando, Charlotte are definitely going to be those teams battling within the mix of where they'll be seated in the play-in tournament. And if, granted, these three teams can play their cards right and Toronto fall off, we could maybe see Toronto falling into that 7th seed spot when it's all said and done. So drop in the comments how you guys think things are going to shape up, at least in the Eastern Conference, and where you believe Miami will be sitting. Because personally, I think they're going to be in the play-in tournament no matter what. It'll be interesting to see if they find a way to be that top 7th seed, though, out of the 4 teams in play-in contention. Which brings up another interesting point that I want to touch on here today regarding Norman Powell and Tyler Herro. We saw in Wednesday's matchup against the Cavaliers that both were actually in the starting lineup. Both, I believe, have played 17 games this season, sharing not a whole lot of minutes together. I believe around 130 to 145 minutes together on the floor. But we're not seeing, we're not seeing a consistent success from these two sharing the floor with one another on a consistent basis. I mean, from at least what I had seen coming out of, or at least right around that, or at least coming out of the game against San Antonio, this duo, when they share the floor together, 5 and 11. So clearly, over the course of this season, there has been some chemistry issues between the two. I've talked about how the two being on the floor together has created more issues on defense than it's created solutions on offense. But I think Wednesday night's game against the Cavaliers was an example of how this, or at least, it was at least an example of having both guys on the floor in a scenario where this could potentially work. And granted, I think defensively, because Miami played so well in the first half, that definitely gave them a leg up. But it didn't make them invincible either, because as we saw in the third quarter, Miami pretty much piss away a 17-point lead and have the game tied going into the fourth quarter. I don't want to say the blame is entirely on Tyler Herro and Norman Powell there, but I mean, you can't just rely on Adebayo, Kel'el Ware, and Davion Mitchell to carry your team's entire defense. I would say having Andrew Wiggins and Jaquez Jr. just back in the lineup, having that physicality in terms of two forwards that are right around that 6'8", 6'9" ballpark, defensively made a huge difference for Miami coming out in this game. So I think if your other supporting cast members can do what they did defensively in this previous game against Cleveland on a more consistent basis, even if Powell and Herro are defensive liabilities, they will find a way to share the floor together and bring in success, at least offensively. Because at least from the game we had seen on Tuesday, both guys scoring just under 20 points, shooting around that 50% ballpark, they're obviously going to have to sacrifice the scoring responsibilities they bring to the floor when the other one isn't there. And we've seen both go on 30-point, escapades over the course of this season. But I think in a scenario where you have both guys scoring just under 20%, they're going to not only be shooting the most efficient, but they're going to allow this team to actually play cohesively in transition, where defensively these two guys are not creating so much of a liability that they're pissing away 20-point games in the third quarter. So I do think there is a world where both of these guys in the starting five can work together. And I do think injuries really have prevented these guys from building long-term chemistry because, again, I just mentioned coming out of Tuesday's game against Cleveland, I believe only these two have only played 17 games together, which is not a lot considering Miami's going into, I believe, their 70th game tonight against the Cavaliers once again. So I think if you have those outside factors helping out on the defensive end, and the two don't necessarily need the ball in their hands for every single possession, I think there is a world where both of these guys in the starting five can work. Drop in the comments what you guys think, and maybe if I'm being a little too optimistic here. Before I touch on, Before I touch on Pelle Larsson, because I want to talk about him more in this episode and how with, Herro and Powell being back and forth in and out of the lineup this year, what his role has kind of shaped up into, especially this season. I want to talk about that more in this episode. But before I go ahead and do that, I'm just going to take a moment here to give a shout out to the sponsor of today's video, Underdog Fantasy. Congratulations, you guessed it. If that was your guess for today's sponsor, it's once again Underdog. Fast breaks, buzzer beaters, and block parties are back. And Underdog is the best place to get in on all the action. Now, playing on Underdog is easy. Just pick whether your favorite players will go higher or lower on stats like points, rebounds, steals, and more. Get your picks right, and you can win up to 5,000 times your cash. Now, this week on Underdog, I'm looking at the matchup where the Miami Heat are taking on the Cavs tonight. I'm selecting Norman Powell for higher than 22.5 points and Donovan Mitchell for higher than 25.5 points. Download the app today and use promo code BASKETBALLFAN to score $75 in bonus entries when you play your first $5. Again, that's promo code BASKETBALLFAN. It's all on Underdog. Make picks, win money. I actually want to backtrack there and say that I select lower for points on Norman Powell, selecting lower than 22.5 points, because looking into tonight's matchup, I definitely think Tyler Herro and Norman Powell will be expected to be back in the starting lineup together. But I want to talk about how that might impact my man Bam Adebayo. As we've seen from his last 5 games, continuing to put up consistent scoring at least. The rebounds have also, I would say, maintained a pretty steady pace, hovering at, I would say, around 8 rebounds per game when you factor in the 21 rebound performance against Houston, as well as the 2 10 rebound performances against the Lakers and the Cavaliers last night. So with that, on Wednesday night. Sorry, got my days all jambalaya here. But anyway, obviously the consistency from Adebayo, at least in what he's putting up in terms of points and rebounds, I feel like is not going to waver through the rest of the regular season going into the playoffs. So with this next contest Miami has against Cleveland coming up tonight, I'm selecting higher on points again because at least in that department, he's been pretty consistent, at the bare minimum hovering around 18 points per game. If you're selecting higher on rebounds, if that number is over 9.5, I'm selecting lower. If that number is higher than 9.5, I'm selecting lower. If that number is lower than 9.5, I'm selecting higher all day. In terms of Bam Adebayo and his assist numbers, as you could see from the last 2 games, a little bit of a more consistent uptick, having 4 assists in Monday's contest against the Spurs, and then Wednesday's contest against the Cavs having 7 assists. So, maybe if that number is hovering around 5.5 or lower, then maybe I'm selecting higher on the assist numbers. But I would say if that assist total is higher than at least 6, then I would personally not go near that. That's just my take. That's just my opinion. And ultimately, I think in terms of what you're looking for in a pick on Underdog from the Miami Heat, you can't go wrong with the captain. The numbers speak for themselves. The consistency speaks for itself. And even when you look at this last contest with Cleveland, where he didn't really shoot the ball all that well either, I believe 7 of 19 from the floor. It was something along those lines. Not a typical shooting night that I feel like we see from Adebayo, who's almost always in that 50% field goal stratosphere, but he's still putting up a 17 and 10 double-double in that game where he's necessarily not shooting as efficient as we normally see out of him. So ultimately, I think, again, looking at those picks that you could make, definitely some solid options there. And I'm very excited to see how Adebayo is going to keep it up through these next couple of games, especially in tonight's contest against the Cleveland Cavaliers. Again, all this on Underdog Fantasy. Make picks, win money.
Must be 18 plus. 19 plus in Alabama and Nebraska. 19 plus in Colorado for some games. 21 plus in Arizona, Massachusetts, and Virginia. And present in a state where Underdog Fantasy operates. Terms apply. See assets.underdogfantasy.com/play and get terms DFSTML for details. Offer not valid in Maryland, Michigan, New Jersey, New York, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. Concerned with your play? Call 1-800-GAMBLER or visit www.ncpgambling.org. In New York, call the 24/7 helpline at 1-878 or text PMI 467-369.
We talked about on the channel here a little bit this season about, potential Heat lifers, and I feel like the only player that is kind of, Tyler Herro maybe a little bit, but I feel like the only player that has kind of graced that conversation seriously has been Bam Adebayo. And we talked about Tyler Herro in that regard a little bit, but I think another player that is worth mentioning that I don't want to say right now has I would confidently say, oh, for sure, is going to be a Heat lifer, but at least has shown strides of it this season. Pelle Larsson, man, from when he was drafted in 2024, especially over the course of this season, he has been forced into becoming an absolute dog. The number of games he started in this year, it's just at least... Okay, comparing his first season, his rookie year compared to his sophomore year, Larsson played in 55 games. This is according to Basketball Reference, by the way. 55 games, started in 8 of those 55 games. Now, in the 62 games Larsson's played in this season, you know how many games he started in? Take a guess. Because it's definitely not the figure that I was expecting, because if you told me at the beginning of this year that Pelle Larsson was going to start in 48 games for the 305, I would have laughed in your face. I honestly would have. Because when you look at least, actually, I'm going to give you a little side-by-side here. Goes from starting 8 games last season to 48 games this season. Goes from playing on average 14 minutes last season to roughly 26 minutes this season. He's going from taking on average around 4 shots per game to 8 shots per game. So double the amount of shots. He is still shooting, I would say, pretty consistently the same from beyond the arc, but at least from outside or inside the 3-point line. Sorry, couldn't figure out how to say that. Inside the arc, he's improved from shooting around 52% to just under 58% actually. And then in addition to that, he's gone from averaging a staggering 4.5 points per game to 11 points per game over the course of this season. So going from 4.5 to 11 in one season. I mean, the development that has gone into Larsson has clearly shown over the course of this season. Averaging nearly more than triple the amount of points he had last year. I mean, I don't know. This could be another Gabe Vincent, Max Strus type of scenario or Caleb Martin, where Miami develops them into a solid rotational piece and then they ultimately go somewhere else to get a bag. But I think in a season where Herro and Powell have been in and out of the lineup, Larsson has totally stepped up at the right time and has totally come into the type of player Miami has wanted him to be. Even more than I think was initially anticipated. So I think that definitely gives a little bit of incentive for Larsson to want to stick around for the long haul. Well, does that mean he's going to be a Heat lifer? I don't know. That we'll have to wait and see. Drop in the comments if you think the strides Larsson has made in his development over the course of this season has, kind of at least pushed the narrative to have him stick around in Miami for the long haul. Lastly, here I want to talk about a subject at hand that ultimately I feel like has been a question for not just Heat fans, but for Miami's front office. How should Miami really approach adding a number one? And I think when you look at Kawhi Leonard, John Morant, Giannis Antetokounmpo, all potentially being those options for Miami this summer, I think you really have to think about how your approach is going to look. Now, we've talked about over the course of this week, if Miami were to consider a full reset, they should part ways with Norman Powell, trade Tyler Herro, trade Kel'el Ware, do a number of things. And I think if you're thinking of a full reset scenario like that, how you approach adding a number one option has to be at the forefront of your mind. It just has to be. Because if you're going to, basically get rid of the pieces you have together, which have shown they can win against any team, but have also showed they can lose against any team, you've got to consider how you're going to move forward, because Miami is definitely not the tanking type, and they're definitely not the type to want to intentionally lose games. So I think in terms of adding a number one option, a trade package could be the best way to facilitate bringing in a player like that. But I think, especially with looking at, I think once you wait for all the Rozier money to completely clear out, you know for sure what you're going to do about Norman Powell and Tyler Herro in terms of if you're actually going to let Powell walk and if you're going to trade Tyler Herro or not. Once you've come up with a decision on that, then I think you can find the best way to navigate bringing in a number one option, because then neither of those two players are going to impact directly how that player might bring success towards this team, or you've at least kind of drawn up a picture in your mind what that scenario could look like with this number one option coexisting with whatever piece you decide to keep, because I don't think bringing in a number one option with Powell and Tyler Herro is a good idea, unless that is a defensive-minded player that they're bringing in. So if it's not Antetokounmpo, I don't really see how that's going to work. But drop in the comments what you guys think Miami should do in terms of shaping up their overall approach to bringing in a number one option. I mean, actually, thinking about it too, Kawhi Leonard also defensively is a pretty strong player, but I don't know if putting him in a starting five with Herro and Powell would completely eliminate all of their defensive worries. That's going to do it for this Friday's episode of Your Heat Latest here on FanArc. Don't forget to drop a like on this video, and please, for the love of God, hit that subscribe button. We're still chasing 600 subs, so I'd really appreciate your support in subscribing to our channel. Thanks so much for joining us once again. I'm Sam Shapiro. Have a great weekend, everybody.